the war's been so terrible, but I actually see this as one which, slightly on balance, is actually positive for climate change.
Welcome back to Breaking Views. I'm Peter Thal Larsen, the global editor, and I'm joined again by Hugo Dixon, the commentator at large for Reuters. Hugo is coming to us this week from the island of Tinos in Greece, which must be warmer and more pleasant than northwest London, which is where I am at the moment. Hugo, good to see you again.
Lovely to see you, Peter.
So the topic this week is we're talking about climate change, but particularly about the impact of the invasion of Ukraine on the whole fight against global warming. And you've had some thoughts about that and sort of weighed up the pros and the cons. Tell us where you got to. Maybe start with the cons and then then we can talk a bit about the possible pros.
Yes, but just to give you the headline, perhaps, is I'm more of a glass half full than a glass half empty one on this, which might be slightly surprising given that there's everything, the war's been so terrible, but I actually see this as one which, slightly on balance, it's actually positive for climate change. But clearly there are lots of negatives. I mean, I think four stand out. One is that there's more coal being burnt in the short run as countries from particularly India and China desperate to get alternatives to gas. Secondly, that there will be more gas supplies that are being created in infrastructure, so that could lock in more global warming. The third is that the rising debt levels around the world and the interest rates required to bring inflation down are adding to debt distress around the world, meaning that there's going to be less money to invest in climate projects. And then finally, I would say an indirect impact of the war in Ukraine is that it's led to a worsening in the geopolitical situation generally, and more specifically, the relationship between China and the US. And after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, the Chinese froze all discussions with America on climate diplomacy. And so those are the main negatives, I would say.
It also just seems to have dropped off the agenda. I mean, it's, we're a little more than a year on from COP26 in Glasgow, when everybody was zooming in to talk about climate change, and that was the sort of the main topic of conversation. And within a few months, suddenly we had a war, and people were focused on other things. Sort of, you almost get the feeling people just haven't got time to think about it as much.
They haven't, and it's not such a high priority for governments or indeed for their populations as it was at COP26, and going into COP27, which is going to be in a couple of months' time. There is not a feeling that there's going to be a lot of momentum there, or indeed the follow through from COP26, because every country was supposed to actually improve their targets and plans, their sort of 2030 plans, by the end of this year. Technically they have, and so far, well, some have come up with new plans, but only one country has actually come up with a better plan. That's Australia.
So so that's the bad news. So tell us what the good news is then.
Well, the really good news is that what is concerning governments at the moment is energy security, and also making ends meet, and economics. And although these are not the same as climate, if you think of a Venn diagram of climate, energy security, and prosperity, those three circles have actually been drawn closer together. There's more overlap between them than there was a year ago. So even if they're not motivated by doing what's best for the climate, their motivation to secure energy supplies and their motivation to try to make ends meet is actually driving large parts of the world towards more renewables and more green technology more generally. And this is going, possibly even gangbusters might not be too strong a word to use for it.
You're right. So on the one hand, people are talking about using more coal or finding other sources of gas, but they're also talking about building more wind farms or restarting nuclear stations and so forth. So I guess you could look at that as positive. But what about the cost? Because one of the worries about all of this is that the shift away from the rapid shift away from gas, particularly, is going to push up the cost of everything. So how does that help? How does that play into the discussion about renewables?
Costs are going up, and the world is more or less poorer, unless you happen to be Norway or the Middle East, or perhaps America because of their shale boom. But most of the world's getting poorer as a result of it. There's no doubt about that. But you have to think about relative prices in terms of what makes sense, what's economically sensible. And the gas price has gone up fivefold from this time last year, and it's forecast to stay more or less the same level for several years to come. And as a result of that, if you're a consumer, it makes even more economic sense to go for renewables, even if in the short run, supply chain constraints mean that there are some cost issues there, but those will probably sort themselves out in a few years. So that's the main reason. But there's also a question of energy security above and beyond the question of the costs. And nobody wants to be dependent on a single source or a small, a single source of energy supplies that is hugely dominant in for your country. And that applies not just to Europe, which has to turn away from Russian gas because it's basically been turned off, but it also even applies to China and to India. And in all of these three locations, and also in America, you're seeing a big ramp up in renewables. And even that IRA, that so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which Biden got through, the biggest ever climate package that America has done, that wasn't directly as a result of the war. But again, if you look at it through the ricochet from Russia to China to geopolitics, America is increasingly concerned about its dependence on Chinese renewables. Mm-hmm. So it's not worried about Russian gas, but it's worried about Chinese renewables. And that IRA, that act, is stuffed full of incentives for homegrown renewables and other green technology in America.
What looks like it was almost definitely bad news, actually, could be some good news in the end. Hugo, good as always to hear your thoughts, and I look forward to chatting to you next time.